If you read the Old Testament and about people like David and Solomon and the typical passages that and the typical people that you'll hear about in the church, if you read it by yourself, you'll get a very different David, a very different Solomon, a very different etc. than you will if you just listen to a preacher's interpretation of it or the points that he decides to highlight. Or I was thinking recently I was reading First Samuel. I was reading about David. And, I haven't seen the new David movie that came out. There's a new David movie, kind of like a Pixar-esque type deal. I think it was by Angel Studios. And I was thinking, I haven't watched the movie. I've had family that have, and they said it's good. But I imagine it seems like it's David in his younger years when he was young, like David and Goliath, kind of the beginning of his story, I'm assuming. So, if that's all it is, then they wouldn't talk about, how he was later on. But I think even if they did, right, we have the story of David, right, man after God's own heart. And, we hear about the sin of killing or committing adultery with Bathsheba, right? We know that's bad. But aside from that, we kind of view him as this just, I don't know, someone that guys should aspire to be. Maybe they've said that. I don't know if I've heard that directly, but in church. But yeah, we just kind of had this idea of biblical manliness, biblical manhood, I should say. I think that's the core of it, right? And if you've ever grown up going to church, you always hear they'll have a sermon on it, they'll have a series on it, they'll have whatever about biblical manhood. And I really don't think they do it for women, but they do it for men. And this idea of what is a biblical man? What is biblical dating? What is a biblical husband, right? I think what the church does is they decide for themselves what they think it should be, right? What a good man should do and be to a woman and to a family and in society, and then they wrap it and in the biblical message. They strategically use verses to support their ideas. So, a few examples is they'll say, a man is supposed to die for his family. A man is supposed to um, be a servant leader, right? A man is supposed to, they'll use the verse that says, submit one to another, you know, be submissive in some way to those around him and their needs. And they'll use those verses, which are real verses, but they'll do it in a way, they'll add that to their message of what they think a man should be, which, funny enough, the church's idea of a biblical man is not very different from society's, which is protect, provide, do the things we want you to do, but also stay on a leash. And don't be toxic. Don't be too manly. Don't be too yourself. Contain it a little bit for us so that we can benefit from your sacrifice and from your efforts and your servant heart or whatever. So we can benefit from you. But, we don't care that much about your opinion or your needs, who you are as a man, right? And we don't recognize your role of authority. But a good Christian man, a biblical manhood is, you're a servant, you're a you're a servant, and it's like that's part of the message, right? That's part of the message, but that's like 10% of it. They ignore all the examples of what men were in the Bible. So I can think of, like, for instance, the story of David, right? We highlight his good attributes, but we don't really like to express him in full, who he was as a kind of a quintessential man. right? And a godly guy. And if you did, you'd be kind of blown away. You're like, how can this be a godly guy if he just is so unapologetically himself as a man in his desires, in his aggressions, and all that stuff, right? And he is. But I feel like if you did, like in the church, like if you did one thing that David did, you'd be ostracized immediately. That's where there's this double standard, where there's this hypocrisy, right? So, like if you read in the Old Testament, and that's not to say that, things that David's doing, all the stuff he does is good. That's not true. But what it should do is it should shed light that as men, although we need to contain ourselves, right, in this idea that you have the sword but you sheath it, right, there's elements to us that they need to recognize and not make it seem like you're evil or whatever because of these tendencies. Because your greatest examples of men in the Bible are the guys that you like to preach about and talk about. If you were telling the whole story, you'd show those sides to them, right? Like David, for example, Bathsheba wasn't the only one. He found a woman he loved, had sex with her, knocked her up, and he killed the husband, right? That's egregious. But there was another instance, right? I think his name was Nabal. This is in Samuel. I think his name was Nabal or something like that, right? And the story is that David came and he said, hey, can we have some of your provisions, right? Him and his army. He said something like to the effect of, we didn't harm you or your flocks or anything like that when we were out there, right? We didn't harm you or nothing like that. You can ask anyone. And Nabal said, essentially, no, I'm not going to do that, right? And, David didn't like that, so he was on his way to kill him. And he was going to slaughter them all, every single guy. And to be honest, slaughter every single guy, and he's probably going to take the women. So anyways, because that's what they did. And he was on his way, and then Nabal's wife went out and talked to him and said, please don't do this. Here, take this stuff. Take some of this as a gift. And said she was very beautiful. And so bottom line is, Nabal found out, had a heart attack, and died in 10 days. I don't know exactly how that happens. It's kind of odd. But in the end, David got his stuff. And then he also took his wife, after he died, and she was really happy about that too. So, and then of course there's the side of David, right? Not only that, right? This incestual, I don't know if that's the right word for that. That doesn't sound right. But this need for women, for whatever, that Solomon had as well, right? But not only that, but there was this warmonger side of him where he wanted to fight and he enjoyed the fight, right? It was just part of him, that aggression and everything like that. And I think a lot of us guys, we have that, right? We have that need to be aggressive, to fight, and then to conquer, and then to get the gal and all that stuff, right? And it's in biblical men like David, a man after God's own heart. It's a real thing. And there just seems to be this idea in the church that, a good little boy, a good little Christian boy, he's not going to have any outward expression of doing that, right? Imagine catcalling a girl in church. Imagine even asking a girl out in church in a way that's a little more public or whatever. Unless it went successful, right? You'd get painted as, I don't know, whatever, a creep or this just indulgent man or whatever, right? There's this idea that you come to church and you drop the manhood, drop the masculinity, and you just kind of become a norm, become just an NPC as you sit in church and then shut up and don't say anything and just listen, right? And it's just so far from who we are as men. Like, we're not made to do that. We're not made. That's why we don't thrive in school. Why school is more of a thing that women are excelling at and going for those higher degrees and stuff like that. Statistics show. We're not made to do that. We're made to conquer. We're made to rule. We're not made to be um, tranquilized or just made to be kind of dumbed down and quiet and just all these like feminine type things like that they're trying to turn men into. We're not made to do that. And I feel like if we read the Bible in its full entirety, it's not that all the stuff that David did, God was like, oh yeah, that's great. That's just what I want, right? But it's the fact God uses guys who are guys, who act impulsively occasionally and aren't afraid to express their sexual desires, their proclivity to fighting and aggression, right? At certain times, just that manliness inside of us, the beast inside of us, right? That needs to be contained and tamed, right? Not just let loose, right? But it's there. And it seems like if there's a hint of that, if there's a hint of this is not a submissive, feminine man, right? At least in his demeanor and in his whatever thinking. If that gets sniffed out in like a church setting, in society in general too, but especially like a church, I mean, that causes issues, man. That's not okay. And I just think the church here's the big point. I think the church has been one of the main driving forces in blurring the lines between men and women and how they ought to behave and their expectations and what's considered acceptable for men versus what's considered acceptable for women. There's been this blurring, which is why we're seeing in Christian women as well, professing Christian women, right? And Christian men, there's a lot of overlap in their behaviors. The drinking, the tattoos, the swearing, goodness gracious. I mean, I feel like most of the girls that I like used to go out with or talk with, they were always more degenerate than me in some way. Not all of them, but a lot of them. They always cursed more. They always, I don't have tattoos. They had tattoos a lot of the times. They always drank more, right? Because I hardly drink. And anyways, I don't think the church has done any good in that regards, right? It doesn't encourage them to drink or get tattoos, but it certainly doesn't address the fact they're doing it. Otherwise, these women wouldn't be comfortable telling themselves they're Christians. So, I'm not trying to get onto the women. That's not the point of this video. But the point of this video is the fact I was reading the Bible. I'm in the Word right by myself. I don't need a pastor to tell me how to read it and what parts to read. And I'm just learning, like, wow, these guys were unapologetically guys and how they were. And, like, that's what Proverbs often talks about, like adultery. And he knows, like, his sons or whatever, he's writing to them. He knows that they are going to, or whoever the reader is, right? He knows they're going to have tendencies to want to do that, to, like, essentially do what David's done. Twice, like, one time was, like, he intended to do it, but then he waited and Nabal died anyways. What's his face? But then one time actually just killing the husband, taking the wife. But essentially did it, let's say, 1.5 times that we know of. Just like killing the guy and taking the girl. Like, very barbaric, right? I think Solomon realizes that, right? And in Proverbs he's talking about, it's like, hey, you're going to have these temptations, but don't do it. That's not the point. Like, don't engage in that, right? God doesn't like it. But he recognizes, hey, like, we have this tendency. And in the church, you can't recognize it. You can't even talk about it. You can't talk about, hey, this is how guys are, and we'll talk about ways you can avoid falling into sin because of your tendencies, but we understand the needs, we understand the desires, we understand the proclivity to being a man. And there's just none of that, right? There's none of it. Kind of an odd topic that I wasn't really planning on talking about or even thinking a lot about. Another thing that I kind of ran into, which was interesting, uh, there's things in Scripture. Okay, here's another element, right? The Bible is always true, and there's always things in it that we can take and learn, right? But the problem is with the church and with the people that teach it is they don't realize that we're in such a different society and we're in such a different situation where these things don't apply directly, or they won't in the way that we think, right? So it's talking like when a man in society today is not given the same respect, isn't given the same position in society, isn't given whatever. He's not the same type of man that a man was in this time, right? It's a different man. You have a very, like, essentially castrated man these days compared to what we used to be, I think. Very castrated, very docile man in today's society. So when you read this and you read about how men are, how women are, how things work, right? It's in the context of things are in the right place for the most part. All these instructions and proverbs, right? But we're living in today where it's in a society where it's like all that's messed up, it's all screwed up, it's all horrible, it's a mess. So it's harder to look through Scripture and find answers, find sometimes. I think at least. I ran into this recently. So it's in Proverbs. He's talking about avoiding the adulterous woman, and he says, "Drink waters." 5:15. Drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed across abroad, and rivers of the waters in the streets. Let them be thine only, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? So this is an interesting verse, and I don't know if he really intended his Proverbs to be for everyone, right? I don't know if that was the purpose, but I mean, it's kind of interesting. You're getting the perspective of a man with hundreds and even thousands, I think, between the wives and the concubines, right? Over 1,000, I believe. It's like 500 concubines and some odd amount of wives. So hundreds and hundreds of concubines and wives telling you, enjoy the wife that you have. Don't take another man's woman. Which, it's funny. It's like, it's kind of silly. It's like, I honestly wouldn't take him seriously, right? I mean, it's in the Bible, so I take it seriously, but if someone told me that, someone that was essentially, I don't know what the word is, jigaboo, a pimp, whatever, and he's like, hey, just enjoy your girlfriend, just don't, mess with other girls, other guys' girls. It's like, bro, you're sleeping with all these women. What are you talking about? And in some sense, in that society, like, he had possession over them, so as far as I can tell, they were just his. But yeah, it's like, it's an interesting perspective, right? You have the modern day man that it's like, he's given no authority, no power, no, nothing. He's kind of a second class citizen. And it's like, he can't even like talk to a woman wrong or he'll get me too'd, right? And you have the Proverbs, the Bible, this dude with tons of concubines and wives, right? Multiple wives and concubines. Just new woman every night, essentially, right? And he's like, hey, buddy, like, just, enjoy your wife and don't, look at other people's wives and just kind of stick with her, and everything's going to be fine. Just don't fall to adultery. It's just really interesting. People seem to take the human out of biblical characters. They don't realize that they're fallible themselves, right? The scriptures is true, but also there can be personality and there can be ideas in there that are from that person that you're just like, that's interesting, right? That's interesting. Like even Paul sometimes would say, hey, this isn't from the Lord, but these are my thoughts, right? In the epistles, he would say that. So in other words, like it's in the Bible, but even he says, you know, this is not the Lord talking, this is me. So we got to realize that that's in the Bible too, but in the Old Testament as well, I think, personally. And there, there's truth to it, there's wisdom to it, but it's just kind of funny. You're dealing with, I don't know what it was like back then, but right now you've got majority of guys and gals, a lot of gals, but for some reason the number's higher with the guys that are single, that don't have families, that don't even have, women in their life. And they're just kind of, they're not proud of who they are as men, as straight guys, as white guys, or heck, as any black guys, whatever, right? As men, I think essentially, right? I mean, I'm talking to anyone really. It doesn't have to be white guys. But yeah, you're just in a different position than you used to be. And you read the scripture and you're like, well, that's helpful, right? But we've got an issue where it's like I can't even do that. I can't enjoy the wife of my youth, right? Because of the problems going on. And I think the main problem, right, is that we go through these scriptures, like the leaders of the church, and nothing sticks out to them. They don't realize, the current problems that we have as men in today's society. And it's just frustrating, I guess. It's just frustrating. Like the biblical advice is true, but it's not all we need. We need more than that, right? Because you can't just tell a guy in today's society, just don't commit adultery, don't lust, don't watch porn, enjoy your wife. That's all you need, bro. It's like you can't even. That's the whole problem. Is the family's breaking down, the birth rates are dropping, people aren't getting married. You've pushed women into, positions where they're focused on their career, so they're not dating or marrying at the rate they used to, or they're opened up to social media, so now their standards are just unrealistic. Our society is so screwed up from our parents and our grandparents' generation that advice is not helpful anymore because we're not in positions to enjoy the wife of our youth. Or like even the scriptures, I should have had it pulled open. This is somewhere in Corinthians, somewhere in one of the epistles, where he says, it's better to marry. He says it's better to be unmarried, but as opposed to burning up with passion. So whatever that is, just like maybe in today's terms it'd be like gooning or whatever. But essentially, get yourself a wife, right? For the reasons of there's temptation in the world, there's sexual immorality, there's opportunities for adultery, etc. So get yourself a wife. Paul said that because it's better to marry than to burn with passion. And it's like, I'm sure that was very good advice back then, but today that's the whole problem. You got a bunch of guys that want to marry, and girls for that matter too, but they can't. They've been pinned against each other, and they're in a society that's not conducive to building relationships and families. So that advice, although it's true, it's not what we need now. Or you can tell guys and gals in your congregation to marry all you want, but to completely ignore the fact that we're in an unprecedented time as far as how difficult it is to do that, just based on statistics alone, right? To ignore that is arrogant. It's not showing love. It's showing just arrogance. And it's kind of like a narcissistic tendency to assume like, hey, I know the right way to do things, and this is the right way to do things, and I'm going to ignore whatever you say, whatever troubles you're dealing with, right? This is what you got to do. And it's just not working. It's not working anymore. Otherwise, guys would not be leaving the church in big numbers, right? And that's what's happening. Guys are leaving the church. And I know a lot of guys that, even though they still attend church, they're very frustrated with it. They kind of see it as a joke. Because let's be honest, the modern church, today's church, most churches are a joke. An absolute joke. And they're not your friend. They're not a safe space for you as a guy. They're just not. And that's, sad, because I grew up going to church my whole life. But yeah. Yeah, I think guys are tired of hearing that message. Like, go get a wife. Just get her done. And that's how you avoid, whatever, lust or porn or whatever it is that you're dealing with, right? And they just always pin it on the guy. I mean, you're just getting attacked from all sides. Let's be honest, guys are getting attacked from all sides. They're getting attacked from society. They're getting attacked from the church. They're getting attacked from women on the loose, And if you just read the Bible, you'd realize, like, wow, times were different. Times were different, man. I mean, a woman couldn't hardly talk to you unless she was spoken to. A woman was modest. She wasn't allowed to run around. They freaking stoned her under God's command. If she committed adultery, she wasn't allowed to leave her husband. All these things that are so different, right? That were God ordained, right? And we live under a new covenant. That's true, right? We shouldn't just be stoning people. But it gives us wisdom into what God thought was evil and what God thought was right based on his commandments, right? And now we have a new and better covenant where everyone can be forgiven and fall under the grace of Christ. But you got to read the Old Testament and understand what God was thinking. And the more you read the Old Testament, you realize, like, wow, we are so messed up. Society is so different than it was. It's so ungodly. And in ways that you would think, like, things that we think are progressive, things that we think are good, things that are now normal, right, are actually bad and they're wrong. And vice versa, things that are considered wrong, that are considered taboo, that are considered, just evil or wrong, were actually either good or God did not care that much about in the Old Testament. And I'm not going to get into all of it, but I did a deep dive, right? A deep dive into the Old Testament and just a lot of very specific things, right? We're just searching for truth here. And like certain sins that God said were direct sins, things that he didn't say were sinful, surprisingly, that you would think he said were sinful, the allowances he gave, stuff like that. And you just realize that, like, the modern day world, and especially the modern day church, are not remotely close to godly. Or in some instances, like, the Holy Spirit ain't working there. He's not working in that church. He's not working in that institution. And what you have is maybe some well-meaning people, maybe they have good intentions, and they, might use certain verses to portray a message that seems good, but either it's very anti-biblical in some instances, right? Is anti-biblical, whether it's differences between men and women and what men ought to be and the, whatever. But also, if it's not very anti-biblical, it's at least not biblical. Like, you can't find it in the Bible. You can't find those sayings, those standards, those principles that we say are true. You can't find those in the Bible. And it just affects your whole thinking. It really does. Like, and if you grow up in the church, it'll affect your thinking. And I've definitely realized, like, as I've gotten out of it and just been in the Word, man, I'm like, wow, things are not what they seem. God doesn't think exactly how I thought he did in terms of what is considered sin, what is considered good, right? And I mean, you can just read the story of David and know, like, God loved David. David was a man after his heart. Adultery was still a sin, right? No matter what, that's a sin. That's the one thing we do know, right? Well, let's not stretch that term though. Adultery is in the instance of you having sex as a guy with a married woman. That's what it is. I did a study into that too, and for some reason, it doesn't mean you having sex with an unmarried woman as a married man. It just means you having sex with a married woman. And then in the woman's case, actually, it's having sex with anyone other than her husband. But, anyways, point being, we don't have to get that specific. Point being is that, that was the main sin. It was the adultery, right? So yeah, David wasn't a perfect guy, but he was unapologetically manly. He wasn't this perfect little good boy saint, right? Perfect little good boy saint like you should be, like the church wants you to be. And just line up, shut up, sit down, be who we want you to be, don't stir the pot. And the church is just great at doing that. And the guys are tired of it. The guys with any ounce of testosterone are tired of it. They're tired of this feminist world, this feminist church where they are brought down to their level and put on a leash and just like a good little dog, that you can lead where you want and do whatever you want with. And I'm fed up with it. My friends are fed up with it. It's just ridiculous. And I think it's going to be more obvious. Guys need something to run too. They can't just leave the church and then be in quiet desperation, right? I think part of the solution is to be around other guys. But yeah, it's messed up, man. And you got to get away from that as best you can. So, and then like I always say, dude, just stay in the Word. Stay in the Word.